It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Thank you all very much for being here. As I was saying, I'm accompanied by a team that has worked on the creation of this project, and I want to mention them because they're here with me. Pablo Lavigne, who is the Coordinating Secretary of Production at the Ministry of Economy, Manuel Chap, who is the Undersecretary of Agricultural Production at the Ministry of Agriculture, Maximiliano Farina, Secretary of State Transformation at the Ministry of Deregulation, Alejandro Cacas, who is also the Secretary of Deregulation at the Ministry of Deregulation, Bernardo Mura, who is the President of the Real Estate Registry, and Paula Tatey, from Legal and Technical Affairs. The truth is that many people within the government have worked on this, but I think these are very representative officials who have worked on this project, which I must say was also a project that was worked on as part of the May Pact. You know that President Milei, together with 18 governors, signed a May Pact. The first point was respect for private property. A May Council was then formed, with a member from the Senate, Carolina Lozada, a member from the Chamber of Deputies, Christian Ritondo, a governor, Alfredo Cornejo, Martín Rapellini from the UI, Gerardo Martinez from the CGT, plus the Minister of Regulation and the Chief of Staff. We worked on a project of this nature and a large part of it has been posted on the May Council website since December of last year. In other words, everyone has been able to see this project or its nature. Obviously, when one presents it, there are always some modifications, but let's say that this project is at the heart of society. I repeat, since mid-December. We, along with President Milei, generally say that his government has two central pillars. The first pillar is to achieve fiscal balance, to have fiscal progress, and that fiscal progress will be achieved by reducing spending and not increasing taxes. That is like a central axis, absolutely immovable, non-negotiable, as we say, of this government management. And the second is that of economic freedom, the idea that Argentines with freedom will be able to do much more than they would in a much more restrictive context. In fact, as I believe is public knowledge, in Javier Milei's first 2 years, in the Heritage Foundation's indexes of economic freedom, Argentina is the country that has climbed the most positions in these 2 years and for these 2 years. But these two axes actually feed into an absolutely central issue, which is that of private property. Why? Because if one has a fiscal situation that is in deficit, where the Treasury is somehow always, let's say, on the edge of the precipice, sooner or later that will lead to a violation of property rights. Sooner or later, either the government is going to have to raise taxes, or it is going to have to confiscate, or it is going to have to deforest, or it is going to have to not fulfill some of its commitments. And so, a weak fiscal situation is a situation conducive to the violation of property rights and economic freedom. We also think that it has a lot to do with property rights, and that is what we are going to address in this project in particular, because when someone is regulated and restricted with basic regulations, they are basically restricting the use of that private property. In other words, both fiscal balance and economic freedom feed the concept of respect for private property. And if we think about all the extraordinary things that our country has in terms of natural resources, human resources and of all kinds, the only input that Argentina was never able to put on the table is respect for property rights. In other words, why did we have so many mining resources for years and no one came to exploit them, or did no one, neither Argentines nor foreigners, dare to do so because there was no certainty about property rights? The same thing is happening, for example, with energy. So, those two elements are central and constitutive of the right to property, which we consider the basis and fundamental pillar of economic growth. No, the truth is that I don't have to tell you because we know them perfectly well, but at the risk of being redundant, I'm going to read Article 17 of our Constitution because now we're going to see that there are many laws that we want to modify that flagrantly violate Article 17. And what does Article 17 say? It says, property is inviolable and no inhabitant of the nation may be deprived of it without a judgment based on law. Expropriation for reasons of public utility must be qualified and previously compensated by law. Only Congress imposes the taxes expressed in Article 4, No personal service is required except by virtue of law or a judgment based on law. Every author or investor is the exclusive owner of his work, invention, discovery for the term granted by law. The confiscation of goods is forever erased from the Argentine Penal Code. No armed force may make requisitions or demand assistance of any kind. So, what this project is about is a compendium of laws that, in our opinion, have violated this Article 17, have harmed the principles of this Article 17, and that we have come to remedy. So, what I am going to do now in a few minutes is to somehow review the different chapters of this law, which are the laws that we are referring to and what modifications we are working on. Proposing, and that will be the fundamental objective of the presentation. Well, it seems to me that I will start with the project that you have. Well, there is nothing more appropriate than starting with the law on expropriations, which is 21,499. And so we are making several modifications. I will list them, let's say, in a brief way, but in Article 4 of the expropriation law we are indicating the fact that expropriations cannot be discriminatory, they must be specific, they must be well-founded. We are adapting the reasons for expropriation to what is contained, for example, in bilateral investment treaties. In Article 10, what we do is identify that expropriation must be compensated at market value. If there is a market value for the property, it basically compensates for the loss of profits derived from the expropriation process. And the moment in which that market value is taken is also clearly defined to make it independent of statements that could affect the value of that property. So, these are all things that somehow preserve the property rights of an expropriated asset. In the event that the public utility of the expropriation is declared, it is clarified that there will be no transfer of ownership without prior full payment of compensation. It is clarified in the judicial process when there is no agreement on the value of the appraisal and the value of the property. And then, when we move on to a regular expropriation, something is incorporated that is also present in all bilateral treaties, which is what is called indirect expropriation, when the state makes policies or takes decisions that, without generating a legal expropriation, what it does is basically not allow the use of the property. That is, as I say, contained in any bilateral investment treaty, and that was not contained in our law. And so here that is also being included as a cause for regular expropriation. Finally, in the so-called abnormal expropriation, it is basically determined that this can only be done by the executive branch. Before, it was by decree, that is, this used to have a slightly broader typology, and what is, will also give rise to compensation, which was interesting because originally, abnormal expropriation, did not have that compensation. So, it was like a rather strange thing, and, in addition, normal expropriation is added. So the changes in the law, 21,499, basically aim to protect the right to property by clarifying the expropriation process, being stricter in the reasons why an expropriation can be carried out and preserving the value of the property, indicating what must be compensated, to the owner in the case of an expropriation. That then takes us to Chapter 2 of the law, which are modifications to the Civil and Commercial Procedural Code and the Civil and Commercial Code. The truth is that there are several articles. This can be summarized quite simply, and it is basically that it has to be to do with eviction proceedings when there is occupation of real estate. And the substantial change that we make here is that the eviction action becomes a summary trial. You know that the Criminal Procedure Code has different types of proceedings. Well, the eviction action is adapted to the summary trial characteristic, which of course, as you know, has different times, other speeds, and that then makes the eviction much more effective. Non-payment is incorporated as one of the elements that can basically trigger the process. Notification to the electronic address is allowed, since notification issues were sometimes complex. The same is clarified. For example, if the property's indicator plate is missing, how the notification is resolved in that case to expedite it. In short, let's say, a series of sworn bonds are allowed when there is an invocation of non-payment. In short, a series of measures that make the protection of the property rights of the owner who has seen their property occupied, usurped or that directly needs, for the different reasons allowed by law, an eviction. And then, in Article 21 of the law, Article 1222 of the Civil and Commercial Code is modified, simply adapting the Civil and Commercial Code to the modifications that we made in the Procedural Code. Basically, adapting the article in the Civil and Commercial Code that has to do with evictions to this summary concept. It is Chapter 2. Chapter 3 refers to Law 27453. It is a very interesting case because it is a law that sought to regularize irregular housing situations. We have now 10 years of this law. This law, in these 10 years, has resolved 0.08 of the cases it had. 0.08 of the surface that had supposedly fallen under the jurisdiction of this law was resolved, which means that if this process continued, we would need 12,500 years to finish the process, because if in 10 years 0.08, well, that's 12,500 years. So this, I would say, is clearly a law that failed in its objective. In the 10 years it achieved absolutely nothing. When one analyzes why this is happening, this failure of this law, one understands that it is very clear why it happened, because basically the responsibility for solving these issues that are eminently territorial was transferred. Because we are talking about an irregular occupation in a specific city, which is the government entity that has the sole capacity to act territorially. The municipality or the province, failing that. But to pretend that this problem was going to be solved by an official sitting on Maipui Street, Libertador Avenue, throughout the national territory, was clearly an impossibility. So, what was generated was a law that made a declaration of public utility that basically blocked any possibility of a solution because it basically took the municipalities out of the game, it took the provinces out of the game, it took everyone out of the game. The legal instruments that exist in our legislation to resolve these problems. It was not possible to resort to USU caption. The PRE law could not be applied. Why? Because everything was subject to an expropriation process that the national government had to carry out, which the national government did not do. So it is a kind of buffer law, that is to say, it was blocked. A problem that is eminently municipal or eventually provincial was taken to the national government. So, what we intend to do in this law is, basically, to eliminate that declaration of public utility, to eliminate that need for that public utility for expropriation and, in that way, to ask the municipalities and the provinces again to act on this problem, to give them the possibility of doing so and, of course, the national government will be, to the extent that it is competent, available to help, in those tasks that the municipalities and the provinces carry out. But this is not going to be solved by an official of the national government, the problem perhaps with more territorial complexity than the one we face, as in the 3 levels of government. So, the truth is that we have several examples. For example, Diego Valenzuela in the municipality of February 3rd went and resolved the domain situation. I simply use it as an example that the solution to this problem has to come from the bottom up, it can never go from the top down. And it seems to me that this is an area that is totally approved because you represent the provinces. So, in this concept of a government that believes that the fundamental powers of the state lie with the provinces, well, this is one more example of the transfer of responsibilities to you, to the provinces and to the municipalities, I believe primarily. And that is why we need to modify this law, which beyond the motivations, there is one thing that is absolutely overwhelming. This law achieved nothing. In 10 years it achieved nothing. This law blocked any possibility of change. It did not even allow private individuals to make arrangements with people. It left people in a situation of defenselessness and indeterminacy. their absolute property rights and did not allow municipalities and provinces to also act to resolve the problem. So, that is the change that we are proposing in 27,453, which is the beginning of a path of joint work, as I say, with the other levels of government. Chapter 4 has to do with Law 26,737. It is quite surprising to me that this law was approved at the time, because I have a hard time thinking of a more unconstitutional law than this one. Well, sometimes, you know, I am an economist, sometimes I look at the exercise of law with quite a bit of surprise. For example, you recently approved a labor reform law, you voted on it twice, it was voted on in the House of Representatives, and it came back. Well, a judge did not like it and said that it was unconstitutional, and no one said anything about this law that is unconstitutional, so no, I do not have a hard time understanding it. But anyway, why do I say that this law is unconstitutional? Well, I say it for several reasons. The first is because I read the preamble to the Constitution, and the preamble to the Constitution says, "No, the representatives of the people of the Argentine nation, gathered in a general constituent congress by the will and election of the provinces that comprise it, in compliance with pre-existing pacts, with the purpose of constituting national unity, advancing justice, consolidating internal peace, providing for the common defense, promoting the general welfare, and ensuring the blessings of freedom for ourselves and our posterity." And here comes the important part, for all the men of the world who want to live on Argentine soil. So this concept, this central concept that our Constitution has, is reinforced in Article 20 because Article 20 says, "Foreigners enjoy the territory of the nation." I mean, can we like the Constitution or not? Now, I think that if there is something in Argentina where there is no crack, it is in the respect for the Constitution. Foreigners enjoy all the civil rights of citizens in the territory of the nation. They can exercise their industry, commerce and profession, own real estate, buy it and sell it. In other words, the Constitution says it directly, it says it directly, it says it explicitly. They can navigate the rivers and coasts, freely practice their religion, make wills and marry in accordance with the laws. They are not required to accept citizenship or pay extraordinary mandatory contributions. They obtain nationality, well, etc. It says it explicitly. It says that it is a central article of our Constitution. That is that country that opened itself to the world to receive that immigration that it received at the end of the 19th century. And, I read a last article, Article 25, which says, the federal government will promote European immigration. That may be a bit trendy, but the important thing is what follows, and it will not be able to restrict, limit or tax the entry into Argentine territory of foreigners who come to farm the land. In other words, let's say that the country was so open to people who wanted to attract their work, their families, their capital to produce on Argentine soil. And there will be some who do it in urban areas, they will build buildings, they will bring factories or they will be able to come, as the Constitution says, to farm the land. This law somehow restricts that, which is clearly a restriction on the property rights of landowners, but it is, let's say, the constitutional part and say, okay, let's move on to the next chapter. Because if I have a law that is flagrantly unconstitutional, I say, okay, this must be repealed and we move on to the next chapter. But, I don't want to stop there. I want to refer to a testimony that Gustavo Fernandez gave yesterday. I don't know if you had the chance to hear him when he was in the Glaciers Law session, the Minister of Production of the province of San Juan. I tell you, if you haven't seen the clip, watch it because it's absolutely extraordinary. An honest official defending the possibility of economic growth in his provinces. It's worth listening to. And he said that poverty in San Juan is the result of the fences that we put up, and he referred to the fact that the fences that we put up against mining had eventually been the reason why the province of San Juan had not been able to develop its full productive potential. It was a fence that we put up, just as perhaps in Tierra del Fuego they put up the deed and this law puts it on the development of agricultural land. We've already repealed it. So, now I know. So, nothing, this law is flagrantly unconstitutional, it flagrantly violates the property rights of landowners, because they are saying who can and cannot sell to. And they are saying that someone cannot sell, which the Constitution says yes, but at the same time it constitutes offense to the investments that we could have. How many of those investments could we receive? We do not know. The science is certain. The Undersecretary of Agricultural Production told me, a pulp mill in Corrientes could give rise to 5 investments of $2 billion each, $10,000 million in forestry investments that cannot be made today due to this law. Well, then, well. However, this law makes a distinction. In reality, when we propose the repeal of the law, we make a distinction between private property and state property. So, what we do here, as you know, in the law, in its current reading, in its current wording, it states that the purchase of less than 1,000 hectares is free and unrestricted. What we are proposing is that for the private sector, for private individuals, for those who come to farm the land, those who come to produce, those who come to invest, there should be no restriction. Now, what we are saying at the same time is that if there is state participation, that is, if the one who comes to buy is a state, whether because the state is buying or a legal entity in which the state has a stake, then we do maintain prior authorization. And this has to do with the issue of national security. So, we distinguish between productive investments and issues of national security. And in this regard, I have to say that we are even stricter than the current version of the law, because in the current version of the law, up to 1,000 hectares could be purchased without authorization. And now we are saying that if there is state participation in any case, be it 1 hectare, 1,000 hectares, or 10,000 hectares, authorization is required. So the authorization process remains in effect, but restricted to the approval of purchases that have state participation. I am going to tell you about a personal experience I had with this a few years ago. I was a professor at a business school in Qatar called JC and I taught in Qatar. Well, they organize meetings with businessmen and then in one of those meetings with businessmen, a businessman comes to see me or I was sitting at the businessman's table and says, Federico, can you buy it? I am interested in buying a dairy in Argentina because I am the person who produces Qatar's milk. I provide milk to 3.5 million people in Qatar, but you can imagine that Qatar is not the best place in the world to produce milk, it's a desert. So, I would be interested in investing in Argentina to produce milk. I don't know, a dairy farmer tells me, 50,000, 100,000 hectares, those are the numbers they have. So I said, no, well, yes, you can do some research, I can put you in touch with people who are in the industry so you can see if it can be done, so you can invest. I think that's fantastic. I told him, what you have to keep in mind is that you won't be able to invest directly because there's a law that doesn't allow, like I said before, forestry companies that want to invest in pulp mills in Corrientes. I can't invest. Then he looked at me and said, Federico, you know what? Forget it, because I simply have 180 countries in the world to choose from. Just with this information that you gave me, it's enough to know that it's a country that doesn't welcome me. It doesn't make sense for me to invest there. Well, and then that dairy farm, I don't know if it would have ever been completed or not, but at that time the interest in the investment was definitely aborted. So it seems to me that how many investments will be withheld, will have been lost because of this law. Who knows? I'll give the example of the paper mills, I'll give the example of the port in Barranqueras. We already know that there is interest in building the port in Barranqueras. Of course, the possibility is needed for the port operating companies, which are legal entities, sometimes foreign, to be able to buy in order to build that port that would radically change all the logistics in northern Argentina, because all the leaves from Santiago del Estero to Estero, Salta, Formosa, Chaco, would go out through Chaco, not Rosario. It is a reduction in the logistics cost for all those areas equivalent to a reduction in withholdings of several points, right? And all those things did not happen because of the existence of this law. So that is why we propose this modification which, I repeat, is not a delegation, but rather a modification leaving the prior authorization record for when there are state purchases. Well, Chapter 5 has to do with the fire law. For many years, the fire law had a very logical criterion that I will try to describe, which was that if someone was in a native forest and there was a fire, they could not change the use of the land afterwards. Do you understand? If you are, I don't know, in Huelva a forest burns, you cannot later change it in Huapi and start building a building in the API. We completely agree with that, and for many years that was the restriction that existed in the fire law precisely to preserve the forests. Native forests, which then also extends to provincial reserves or provincial forest reserve areas. But the modification that was made to this law at one point is something very surprising, in my opinion. Look at what was written in the modification. Let's see if you think this makes sense. Let's see if you think this, because remember, this is a law to protect native forests. And suddenly it was modified and the following was written. It says, in the event of a fire, whether caused or accidental that burns live or dead vegetation in agricultural areas. In other words, we are not talking about native forests, we are talking about agricultural areas. Any agricultural activity that is different from the use and purpose that the surface had prior to the time of the fire is prohibited for a period of 30 years from its extinction. I do not know if you find this reasonable. The modification of the use of a surface is prohibited. The modification of the use of a surface for the purpose of developing intensive agricultural practices, except in cases where such practices and methods preceded the event. In other words, I have an established forest, it burns down, which is already a catastrophe for me as a producer, and while I wait for the forest to grow back, I want to raise livestock in that area, but I can't do that. Or if I used to grow wheat for 30 years, I can't grow barley, I can't do anything else. In other words, I don't know where or under what concept or logic someone thought that it could make any sense to extend this protection of native forests that we agree on and want to reinforce in the new wording to agricultural production. So, what we are proposing in this modification is simply to return to the original spirit that if there is a native forest and there is a fire, intentionally, it cannot be changed because the native forest itself is to be preserved. Now, in agricultural production, it is absurd, to extend this same concept and affect the property for 30 years without being able to make any modifications. This is not how it would be controlled either, right? Because, well, for that reason, it also seems important to me to be able to do it. Well, and I'll finally come to the modifications of Law 17,801, which are the real estate registry. Yes, it basically worked with all the real estate registries throughout the country. Certain modifications were agreed upon. I'm just going to mention a few chapters, but this is basically a chapter that basically allows the digitalization of registries, right? So the use of technologies, information and communication of internal processes and links with citizens are incorporated. The deadlines are unified. The principle of specialty and determination of the object and subject and access to reliable information are improved. In fact, let's say, a federal digital network of innovations is set up so that there is a more agile flow of information on the real estate registry between the different jurisdictions. Basically, if there are questions, of course we can go into greater detail, but these are simply improvements that have to be made. With efficiency, digitalization, transparency and access to information from real estate records. And for that, the law had to be changed, which is what we are proposing. So this, senators, would be a bit of a presentation and we are open to questions and comments that you have to make. I don't know if the officials are approaching us. Yes, before that I was going to tell you now, as I said at the beginning, the minister is accompanied by,